Yeah, so comorbidities, I now can't say it. What is a story about a couple of exhausted parents who decide to rekindle the intimacy in their relationship by making a sex tape. And the story operates in a sort of like cluster of tension because the main narrator is very anxious about her relationship. She's very anxious about her kids. She's very anxious about climate change. And she's really trying her best to like foster intimacy between her and her partner, but they've got these very little children, and it's probably unique in the collection in that like the relationship between her and her husband is actually genuinely positive. It's very hard to write a positive relationship in a short story. Um, and they're very loving towards each other. They really care about each other. They really like each other. But there's a distance that has been introduced by the kids, by becoming adults, by becoming compromised by midlife. And they make this ill-fated tape, and she's anxious about it sort of leaking into the slime of the internet. And her husband's Chinese, she's a white woman. There's some anxiety about the racial kind of, or the hybridity of the family, and the cultural gaps that exist. So that was pulling on my sort of Hong Kong background. But it encompasses the themes of the rest of the collection, which is about like kind of like midlife. How do we negotiate compromise, and the pleasures of parenthood, the costs, what it means to sort of subvert traditional ideas of motherhood as well as like womanhood in general. A lot of the stories are about women oppressing other women, especially in the workplace. So it's just like great fun to write these stories because, yeah, as I said before, they were kind of like discharge moments where I got to kind of fantasize about being a much nastier version of myself. With the first story called Leslie in Therapy, that was really very much based on my own experience. So I had my second child. I went back to work and I signed up for this training, which I thought was a sort of like, I had misunderstood to be a training in sort of your employment rights and like how to negotiate workload, a very professional session. And then it turned out to be a sort of like therapy session, which involved a lot of emotions and crying. And I was like, oh, no, I'm not signed up for this. This is not what I want. I don't want to bring all the mushy motherhood stuff into my workplace. I wanted that to be clean of all that. So I started with that, just that incident, thinking about like, of course, for me, I sat still and like sort of tried to get along with the session, right? But in the character that was made out of this, she sits in the session and then ends up like throwing a missile at the therapist in an act of revolt because she is unwilling to look at the feelings that the therapist is asking her to, and she aggressively, violently assaults the therapist for this demand on her. So you can see that like me in reality is sort of like safe and contained. And then what's happening in the story is the kind of fantasy of like what would happen for women if they enacted these transgressive fantasies of like what would happen if I threw a missile at the therapist and then refused to apologize. So it's like, yeah, it's kind of this psychogeographical space of like women refusing to be nice. In a novel, you could write pages of conversation, right? Like I find a lot of writing difficult, but I never find dialogue difficult. I think it's because I talk a lot. But in a novel, like that might take scenes and scenes or pages, and then in a short story, you don't have very much room to maneuver. It's like very brief. So you want just a few lines of dialogue to distill the theme or the subject of the story. Having said that, I think I do use dialogue quite a lot. I don't know why that is. I think maybe it's just like women talking about things, women trying to talk about things, women trying to talk about feelings that confuse them, that they don't understand, and then trying to put that into words. I think it's interesting in a short story because like stories are necessarily sort of predicated on subtext and what is buried underneath, whereas dialogue can tend to like articulate things in some ways quite explicitly. But dialogue's great in other ways because it's really illuminates, if you're in close third person in the mind of the character, then what they're saying and what they're privately feeling, you know, if there's a big gap in that, that's where fiction works, isn't it? It's in the engine of like public performance and private behavior. So yeah, dialogue maybe skirts those two things quite interestingly because we're not always intentional in what we say, or like the extra metaphysical kind of meaningfulness of like what we're saying. Wedding Day is one of the stories from the collection, and she is the narrator, who is unnamed. Her ex wants their daughter to be a bridesmaid at his new wedding to the new wife. And the ex says no. The narrator says, no, I'm not going to do that. And he tries to persuade her. And she says, okay, you know what? I'll do it on one condition. So bargain is just a great start for a story, right? Because it's immediately injects that tension. So the condition is she goes to your wedding, but you have to return her. So you have to leave your wedding day and bring her back to my home. And she does it purely out of spite, venomous vengeance that he left her. And now she's saying, okay, well, you leave your wedding, you return our daughter. And she knows as soon as they're in the house that there will be this erotic charge, which he won't be able to resist because that is what survives the death of their relationship. And it's beautifully twisted and mean and mendacious and fun and vengeful. And it was just great fun to write. And it's quite interesting with that story because she sets out the condition, delivers the child to the wedding, and then most of the story is just her wandering around London trying to think about what to do, think about their relationship, think about whether he's actually going to leave the wedding for an hour. And, you know, so there's only two real scenes in that story, which is the dropping of the child and then like whether he comes back with the child. But you can just feel the tension because it's so awful to make a groom leave his wedding day, right? And yet he accepts the bargain in exchange for the daughter. So there's something horribly psychological going on between them that is unnamed but visceral, I think, in their love, hatred for each other.